QCS, Quality Control Solutions. That's what we're covering today. And I'm going to be doing this at I want to walk you guys through what the process actually looks like in Syteline. So this is going to be a much more visual concept to walk through. And I guess, everyone has different levels of knowledge of QCS. Some of you guys might already be using QCS in your system, while other companies are maybe considering if this would be a match for their business. So firstly, I want to go over what is QCS in Syteline. So this is used to track quality test of goods. And in most cases, these products need to meet a certain quality standard. So QCS allows users to disposition and move the product based off of the QCS inspections and their test results. This includes additional areas for material review reports, which most people know as an NCR or a non-conformance report, as well as areas with preventative action, corrective action reports, and record keeping and filtering for QCS data.
Mitch, sorry to interrupt. Did you skip the cover page of the presentation?
It should just be the QCS logo with a little ribbon.
With a little badge?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Okay, sorry about that. Please go ahead.
Yeah. So one thing I've noticed over the past 3 years is a massive increase in companies prioritizing the use of QCS. So beforehand, only a handful of companies I worked with used QCS. The majority involved incorporating QCS. So it's been really nice to see as things have transitioned to the cloud. That since QCS is no longer a separate optional module, more and more companies are realizing the advantages and what can be leveraged with QCS. So here's kind of a overall of the 4 topics I want to go over today. So firstly, QCS is not an all or nothing module. You can see here it's broken down into 4 separate modules, which each have their own workbooks and can use separately or together. So you can see here we have QCS supplier, we have in process, we have customer, and we have enterprise. So I want to do a brief overview of kind of what all these cover. And first we have the QCS supplier. Okay, so QCS supplier, this focuses on vendor quality testing. So this gets triggered at the point of PO receipt, and tests can be performed at that time, or they can get put on hold and reviewed at a later time. This has to do with things called vendor RMAs, also known as a BRMA. So this is the process of tracking returns, credits, and replacement of damaged inventory between you and the vendor. And as well, we also have the track and performance. So this has to do with a vendor scorecard. So this allows the rating and scoring of a vendor on a variety of areas like timeliness of deliveries, frequency of QCS issues from the purchased product. So this helps customers rank their vendors and potentially leverage better pricing negotiations going forward. Okay. Next up, we have QCS in process. So in process is meaning production. So for our job orders. So this has to do with in-process testing while a job is actively on the floor. You can do cost of quality reporting and corrective action reporting as well. Next up, we have QCS customer. So this has to do with this can help you prevent shipping of a finished good until that final inspection has been completed. You have your certificate of conformance report as well that you can use, and you can make this mandatory where you can't even ship a product until you've printed the COC and done your final inspection. As well with that, you can do customer complaint tracking, where you have a whole hub where you can track and manage customer complaints. You can add reason codes, cause codes, and use that for record keeping going forward. As well, we have RMA inspection. So for return material authorization inspection, where incoming goods coming back from a customer, you can do QCS on those products as well, where it'll essentially get put into a quarantine location where you can do your inspections and then move the product accordingly. Okay, lastly, we have QCS Enterprise. So this, compared to the other 3, it's a QCS module that allows users to track quality information that is associated with your quality system and is not directly associated with materials. So the first 3 areas we looked at deal with the handling of inspecting of materials, while QCS Enterprise focuses on tracking quality activities and topics that are key to continuous improvement. So this is, you can see on the top row there, this is a function called QA processes is one option, which is the uses of phases and activities. So essentially a good example of this is a onboarding or sanitation checklist. So these can be cross-referenced to change management requests or topic review reports. In row 2 here, we can see is change management requests. So this is the focusing on the documentation of how, what, and when changes were made. So this can be a requested change for a process, a material, a cost, etc. And obviously the main point of QCS Enterprise is the record keeping of these things. If someone says, hey, I want to change this process, I think there's a risk here. We have it documented who set the change, who is in charge of reviewing the change, when did they review it, so on and so forth. And lastly, we have topics. So topics is all other quality documentation. This can be, SOPs, recording safety issues, improvement opportunities, and so on. And these are also cross-referenced to topic review reports and also corrective action reports. Okay, so for now, I want to focus on the supplier quality inspection process flow. And we're just going to kind of go through what that flow looks like in Syteline. Okay. So first off, we have the PO receipt. So like I mentioned prior, the first trigger for a supplier inspection is a PO receipt. And what it's going to do, it's going to create something called a receiver, which I'll go over in more detail later. Okay. If our PO receipt requires an inspection, we can go ahead and enter in our recording of our tests. If not, we can have this product get moved to inventory automatically. Essentially, this product is either triggered for a QCS inspection or it's not. Okay. From there, after we record our test results, we have the ability to accept or reject that disposition. Disposition meaning just the movement of the goods. So if I have accepted what my test results were, then it just gets moved to inventory through a regular stock or quantity move, where I can move it from my quarantine location to my stock location. And if I reject it, I can choose to create an MRR, which is a material review report. From there, I can go ahead and create corrective action reports. I can cross-reference my tests, certain parts of my test, to this material review report, maybe where the problem originated from. And from there, I have another option to then accept or reject my disposition based off of how my MRR went. Okay. If there was an issue, then my final step is I can just reject the material, which means I can scrap it or remove it from inventory from there. Okay. So I want to actually walk through the full flow here. So this is going to be very visual. So you can, first up, we have the PO receipt and the mention of a receiver, like I mentioned. So the term receiver may be unfamiliar with some of you attending this webinar. So a receiver is essentially a unique QCS record. So each PO receipt will create a unique receiver number. These receivers are used for tracking and managing all my QCS activities linked to this particular PO and item in this case. Okay, so not sure if everyone here is familiar with Syteline, but here's a typical purchase order receiving form here. And the only thing I really need to do is I have my quantity, I have my item, I click the receive button, and we can see here in the screenshot below is that it says create receiver was successful, and it automatically creates that QCS receiver, and it also automatically puts the item into a QC inspection location that I've defined. And in some cases, it's a non-nettable quarantine location, and from there, we're essentially saying I need to do my inspection, and we'll see how it goes from there. Okay. Next up is the supplier inspect/disposition form. So this, I would say, is the main hub when you're managing QCS. And there is a unique form of this for in process, for customer, for RMA as well. But we can see here, this is just the one for supplier. Okay, just first thing I want to see with some of these arrows here is that we can see that this receiver is linked to a specific item that I received. So it's linked to an AL 14,000, which is steel. I can also see here that it's linked to my vendor, it's linked to my PO, it's also linked to the lot that I received on the PO, and this is what we're going to use for our whole QCS process. Okay, I can see as well my quantity received is being updated automatically based off of my PO receipt. You can see my bar graph at the bottom that is going to be updating as we go through this process. And typical, the next step that I would do is the recording of my tests/defects. So we did our PO receipt, we put the product on hold. Now we want to see if it's going to be passing some of these tests. Okay. So looking here, this is just if I click the button, this is just one of the forms that's used for recording tests and defects. A few things to mention here is that you can see with my first arrow at the top is that there's a minimum, a nominal, and a maximum value that has been defined for this item. This is essentially the range that I want my product to be within. And the arrow below is the actual minimum, nominal, and maximum values that I'm recording with my tests. Quite a bit to see on the screen, but you can also see I can enter how much I've tested, how many have failed. I can pass it, I can complete the quantities, and I can also do this testing, whether it's by a batch, which means I'm sampling 30 of 50, or depending if you're using maybe more precise serial tracking or lot tracking, you can also do the testing by each, which means I'm testing every single value. Okay, one thing we can see from here as well is we can define different severity levels of each test. So in this test, I'm doing a measurement. And I can define the product that I'm using. I can define the equipment that I'm using to perform this test. And once I'm done with my test, I would enter in all my results. And then from there, I can be brought back to this form where you can see my next arrow is pointing at something that says disposition QC receiver. And looking at dispositioning is the movement of the goods based off of my QCS process. So like we saw prior, I received 30, or I tested 30 of the 50 so far. Maybe I didn't have time to complete the rest, but so far I've completed 30. And from there, you can see I have 3 options. I can accept, I can reject it, or I can put it on MRR hold. So looking at the first one here, here's our QC acceptance. So I can see I put 20 have been accepted. I have different reason codes. So in this case, I chose a compliant material reason code. I also have a disposition code, which means what am I doing with this product? So all of these reason codes and disposition codes are user defined. You can decide, you can completely change how you want these to be, and you can use that for record keeping in the future. So in this case, I have one called complies and move to stock. Now what that's going to do is that once I click the process button, I'm moving this 20 accepted material from my QC hold location to my actual inventory location. It has passed the test. We're putting it back into inventory essentially. Okay. Next up is my rejection. So I've rejected a quantity of 5. I've given it a not to spec reason code and a disposition code of issue from stock. Now what this is going to do is I've fully rejected it. I've said it is unsalvageable. I don't even want to review it any further. I want to just remove this from inventory. Okay. Lastly, we have the QC MRR hold, which is essentially, like I mentioned prior, an NCR. And this one means I want to do further review. I'm unsure if this is passed. I need someone else to do a second pass. And from there, they can determine whether we are going to accept or reject this material. One thing to note as well with this disposition process, we have the ability to print reject, accept, or hold tags. I typically see the hold tags being most commonly used, and what this means is that the moment I put that item on a QC MRR hold, it'll automatically print just a hold sheet for me that I could affix to a box or a pallet. Okay, so we can see here our bar graph is updated a little bit. We can see near the top that based off of my dispositioning, this form is tracking what has been accepted, rejected, and put on hold. I can see the current status of my receiver. I can see how much has passed and failed. And one thing as well that they've added is I can see my most recent test and my last one as well, just for a quick glimpse. One thing I want to show as well is on this form, you can see there's a bunch of buttons on the right. And the first one here is called the control plan or QC items form. I definitely want to drill into this one because this is essentially where we define what and what is not a QCS item. So here's a look at the QC items form. First thing we can see here is that I can define for this item, for this steel, the reference type of P. From my first arrow means it is for a supplier, and I can also define this by a vendor. So this QCS items form defines unique QC inspections by item, which can be further refined to be unique by vendor, customer, or a job operation. So for example, I can have a receiver be created for any PO receipt for this steel, or maybe I only want to require a receiver to be created when a PO receipt occurs for a specific vendor and item. One thing as well with here, we can see near my bottom is that I have in section for the inspection frequency and the break between inspections. This is one I want to cover as well. It's very important, but these are unique inspection frequencies, meaning these frequencies can be used to determine when to create a receiver. So a few examples is I can create a receiver by the number of receipts, or the number of pieces I've received, or the number of days between receipts. So for example, I can trigger an inspection every 2 PO receipts, or I want to do a QCS inspection for this product every 30 days. Maybe my new vendor I'll inspect for every PO receipt, while a more reliable vendor I'll only want to inspect every 2 months. So this is a really cool form that you can use to kind of determine that. Okay, one thing as well here is there's a section here where my arrow is called control plan tests. So this is a form where you can define different types of tests, including different levels of severity, the equipment that's required to perform the test, the minimum, nominal, and maximum values the QCS test ranges need to be within. There's also additional functionality with tracking the gauges and equipment that is used for the QCS testing. So these gauges can be used for tracking and recording the calibration of the equipment, as well as the usage history of the equipment. Okay, looking back at the main inspect/disposition form, just a few other notable buttons that I wanted to mention is, here's one for our PO line, where if we click this, we'll drill directly into the purchase order where the receiver was created from. I can go and create a corrective action report depending on if I want to do any additional record keeping for this product. As well, I can run a QCS test results report, which I can see, the test that was performed by who and when and how the results went. But the next one I want to focus on is the material review report that I've been mentioning prior. So let's just take a look at what that material review report looks like. So like I've mentioned before, this is an NCR, a non-conformance report. An MRR is just the Syteline equivalent. And this is kind of the main hub where I can do further. We can see here with my arrows, problem description. So the packaging appeared damaged, cause of defects. And you can see here there's cause codes, there's reason codes. This is the main area where I can add any additional information, and it can be assigned to someone else at a later point. So this was the initial 5 that I put on MRR prior when I dispositioned. You can see here there's also a section here for correction and containment, where I can add, what needs to be done going forward, what is the corrective action that we need to be doing. So this is one thing I like to always show, because this just shows the record keeping side of things with QCS, right? Obviously, the whole point of this is continuous improvement, right? We want to document how these changes can be improved going forward. One thing as well here, you can see there's a quantity of 2 that has been accepted and 3 were rejected. I didn't show that part of my PowerPoint, but that's just another disposition where, based off of the 5 that was on hold, I did a further test and analysis, and 2 of them have been accepted and been brought back into stock, while the 3 that were rejected can either be removed from inventory, or in this case, you can create a VRMA, a vendor return, for that quantity of 3. So looking here at the bottom, this is also where I can cross-reference my MRR to a corrective action report. And you can also see here I created a VRMA. I just clicked that XREF VRMA button, which automatically created a vendor RMA. Taking a look at the vendor RMA, this is where you can see here a bunch of arrows just showing the linkage. So we have a VRMA number. It's linked to our vendor. It's linked to our receiver. And it's also linked to the MRR number that we created along the way. So this is a big emphasis on the visibility and the linkage between all the way back from our PO, all the way now to a vendor return. We have the linkage the whole way across. One thing as well with just some of these buttons here on the right, with my vendor RMA, I have the option to scrap the material. I can return it back to the vendor. I can receive new material back from the vendor if they have provided a replacement. And I can also print a vendor packing slip for the shipment return. There's also a whole section here where you can do the voucher and credit process if you're going to be getting some money back from the vendor based off of how the inspection went. And one thing as well with the VRMAs, or just the vendor side of things with quality, is that you have your scorecard. So this score can be based off of delivery, their quality, and performance. So you can create your own scoring metrics as well. And this is a great tool for comparing and ranking vendors to help with future negotiations and keeping accountability for your vendors. Okay, so that covers the supplier inspection side of things. Obviously, this was a very high level overview of what that is. I do want to quickly go over the in-process as well and the customer, but in terms, I'm just going to kind of go over just the initial process flow and some of the main differences between the in-process versus supplier. So with the in-process, our trigger was a PO receipt. Obviously for in-process, it's the release of a job. So the moment my job status is changed to released, if that item is flagged as a QCS item, it's going to go ahead and create a receiver for us. From there, the same question is an inspection required? If no, then it just moves on to the next operation. If yes, we're going to record our tests and results. We're going to either accept or reject that disposition. If we accept it, same thing, we move on to the next operation. If not, we can go through that MRR process again, maybe create a corrective action report if we'd like. We can cross-reference our tests, and then from there we have another question. If we accept it, it gets moved to the next operation, and if rejected, we can reject the material. We can essentially lower the job balance or scrap a quantity from the job if required. Taking a look here at the IP job inspect disposition. So the other one was called supplier inspect disposition. This one is for in process. We can see here in terms of look, it is very similar to the supplier one, but obviously this one is for our jobs. We can see here it's linked to our DJ299 was my job number, and it's also linked to the routing step, which is operation 20. So there are typically two ways I see in process being used. In some cases, customers like to have a unique routing step called inspection or QCS. And what that does is it's essentially a visual cue for someone when they get to that QCS routing step. They already know, oh, hey, I got to go do my test results. And based off of that, we can move on potentially to the next routing step. The other alternative is instead of having a formal routing step called inspect or QC, you just link it to an initial routing step that you already have defined. So essentially, it could be part of my welding process or part of my sawing process. I can just link that QCS receiver to that specific process. There's also an option to use in process just for record keeping of test results and have it not impact the job balance, or we can essentially just turn on a setting where based off of our dispositioning, we're actually going to change the overall job balance. One thing to see here as well, just near the bottom, is that this received, complete, and moved quantities, this is being automatically updated based off of the status of the job as it's moving through the shop floor. So that's kind of one of the main differences between supplier and in-process. Obviously, supplier, everything to do with a vendor and a PO receipt. In-process is linked to the job itself, and we're moving along with the job process. You can also add multiple QCS inspections, even for one job. So obviously, this one is linked to operation 20. I could have 3 different receivers be created for operation 20, 40, and 80, so to speak. Okay. I also want to just briefly walk through the difference for the customer quality inspection process. So first up is the just creation of a receiver, then same thing, inspection required, my test results. If no inspection is required, it is just the regular order shipping process. Or if you're using pick, pack, ship, it would be the shipment master process. Okay, accept or reject. If I'm accepting, I do have the ability, the main distinction is the generating of my certificate of conformance. And the main thing for customer quality inspection is that we can prevent shipment until the receiver has been addressed, until we have entered in our test results. You will not even be able to ship the product. Okay, so here's the CO inspect / disposition form. So the main difference for the customer receivers is that you can make QCS inspections required. You can print your certificate of conformance report, and you can really, the main focus is the potential trigger or prevention of the shipping until this has been done. So customers that have that formal process of inspection prior to shipping, this could be a potential candidate. So obviously I've mentioned the certificate of conformance report as well. So you can attach specific tests you performed as well as any other notes pertaining to the inspection, and then have that automatically be printed for you prior to shipment. One thing with QCS customer as well is that we have the option for QCS with RMAs. So you can see here's just a screenshot of a typical RMA return transaction. You can see here I got a pop-up saying create receiver was successful for AL 10,000 and receiver number 354. So we can have this automatically move our product to a QC hold or non-nettable location for QCS inspections and tests to be performed. One other thing with QCS customer is a section called the customer complaints. And I know customers I work with, they always say, we never get complaints, Mitch, we never get complaints. Well, I know, obviously in the real world, there are always issues that are going to come up. So one cool feature for tracking the customer complaints is that you can link these to a specific PO, an order, an MRR, a corrective action report, or an RMA, and you can quickly drill into that required data by clicking one of the buttons on the right. You can see here there's quite a bit of data on this form, so you can run a report or filter, and you can review the reasons or causes of those complaints. For example, I could filter for a list of all my sub-assemblies within the last 3 years that received a reason code of damaged. And from there, I can review the root causes of the damage all in one form. So it's a great way to capture and analyze areas for improvement within a company. You can see here, there's also some other cause codes and reason codes. These are all, like I mentioned for other things, these are user defined. So you can have reason codes that are specific to your business that when a customer complaint comes in, you can assign it a certain code and then go from there. One thing I also want to mention is with the addition to the Gen 2 forms. So everyone has their own opinion on the Gen 2 forms, but the one cool thing they have done with this new Gen 2 is they actually consolidated all of the supplier, the in-process, the customer, and the RMAs all into one form. So everything I showed prior, we had our supplier inspect disposition, we had our in-process inspect disposition, and these were all unique forms. So one thing they have done with the Gen 2 is they've consolidated it all into one big form. Okay, and lastly, we have the module QCS Enterprise. So this focuses on tracking the quality activities and topics that are key to continuous improvement. So one of the ones I typically see used is QA processes. So this is used for a consistent methodology and reporting structure for any process that is repeated within an organization. So a typical process could be a new product introduction, employee onboarding, or a sanitation checklist. Quite a bit of info on this form. You can see near the bottom, I essentially have these phases of identifying the change or doing research, and I can set the amount of days that it's required to perform this. I can set start dates, completion dates, and so on and so forth. And then even drilling further, I have within my phases, I have further activities that can be performed. I can assign this to employees and departments. I can see when it was started, when it's due to be completed, which activities have been completed. And from even within those phases, I have the additional activities within each of those, where you can add additional notes, set other completion dates, assign it to certain resources. So this is a really good way of tracking that structure. One of the things we've mentioned is change requests. So you can cross-reference a change request to a change management request and a corrective action report. You can enter additional notes, costs, and completion statuses for specific requirements like a change in process, a change in documentation, a change in material, a change in a tool. So from there, you can drill further into those, and you can see here there's quite a bit of info with report date, departments, initial notes, so on and so forth. One thing as well is the quality control home form. So anyone that works within Syteline is probably aware that the home forms do exist. This is the Gen 2 version of it, and I do like it quite a bit. You can see here probably information overflow, but we have anything that's past due, and you can see here if I click those, I can drill into my my 68 MRRs that are past due, or my 5 COCs that need to get addressed. Right. So this is the main hub where you can filter for my supplier receivers, my CO receivers. I can drill on the left side. I can quickly drill to some of the other QCS forms like my gauges. And lastly is quality on the floor. So everything I've shown so far is QCS and Syteline. I do want to mention I'm also a factory track consultant, so I had to mention this as well, but QCS can also be done from a handheld. So you can do your test results from a handheld, you can do your dispositioning from the handheld. Obviously it's a handheld, so the screen's going to be a little bit smaller. As well on the right side here, we can see QCS on a tablet. So same thing, entering my test results or dispositioning based off of my test results can all be done on the floor. So this could be, you could have a mobile tablet that you can walk around with on the floor and do your inspections for an in-process job on the fly. And that, I know I probably talked too quick here, but that's everything I wanted to cover. I didn't have enough time to kind of go over everything within factory trackers looks as well, but from what we saw within Syteline, the form, fit, and function is pretty much the same, right? Enter my test results and then disposition based off of that. So that's what I had covered today, folks. Hopefully that was informational for everyone, and I'll open it up for the Q&A side of things.
Thank you so much, Mitch. And now we're moving into the Q&A section, and this is a good chance to ask your questions. And Mitch, we have one question from Richard from the stage of the customer complaint stage.
Okay.
Would sales typically be filling out these customer complaints?
Yes, I typically see sales being involved with that. So depending on who's the first person in contact with the customer complaint, from there, whoever gets that complaint essentially may be in charge of filling that out. And if the customer gives you any additional information, like the PO or the CO that's involved, you can go ahead and add that additional information. But yes, it is typically sales that is involved with the customer complaints.
Mm-hmm. And I drop it a comment on the chat section. If you have a question, feel free to use chat or Q&A function. And if you would prefer to ask directly, you can raise your hand and I'll call on you to unmute. And Mitch, I see a question on my end too. How long is the setup for creating QCS items?
Yeah, so the process of creating a QCS item is the same as it would be for creating a regular item in Syteline. So a QCS item, it's not a new item, but you essentially flag certain items from within your item master as QCS eligible. So the main reason for that is that only certain items you would want to perform a QCS inspection on. If I have a nut or a bolt in my system, I don't necessarily want to perform a QCS inspection for that. So it's essentially just a data load via paste rows append for any items that you want to be used for QCS. And then from there, you can create unique tests. And then you can also copy those tests to other items that would match that criteria.
Okay, thank you. And Reza has a question. I'm not used if I missed that there was UCL, LCL, and AQL or statistical charts.
Yep. So you can use AQL, so accepted quality levels. So what you can actually do is you can have the system define what number of items you want to inspect. So let's say, for example, I have a PO and I receive 50. Based off of my AQL settings, I can set items to be like a tight or a loose item. And then from there, it's going to recommend how many I should inspect. So it's going to look at my prior inspections for that item. And it's going to say, hey, this item has been failing a lot of inspections lately. I want to inspect 85% of the items that I received because it's essentially a high risk item.
Okay, and we have one more question. From Dylan, does an in-process disposition unmove pieces when disposition to MRR? It's on the chat section.
Okay. So there is a setting on the IP parameters whether or not you want in-process QCS to impact a job quantity. So in one section, you can just turn it off, which means that I'm not going to change the job balance based off of my tests, or there's an option to turn it on, which you can essentially trigger a job move to the next routing step. And you can also, based off of your MRR rejections, you can also actually scrap the product and lower the overall job balance. And that's kind of comes down to what I mentioned earlier, is that some companies have a defined routing step called QC or inspect. And in one case, someone does their inspections and their tests, and then someone else on the shop floor will actually formally move the product. Whether they're using factory track, they could do a job move and move it to the next routing step. So either way I see performed, but it's just a little setting on the IP parameters.
And one more question from Narendra. I'm from Fancy Windows. How can I get this enabled in our deployed version? And if there are any documentation available for it and we can access those links would be helpful.
Yeah, well, I do work with Fancy Windows actually, so I can definitely help you out with that. Feel free to send me an email as well, and I can walk you through that process. First thing I would say is make sure the optional module is turned on. So there is a form called optional modules in Syteline. Make sure QCS is turned on. And then from there, really, it's just the initial setup of creating the items. And really, once you've created the item from the QC items form, the moment you do a PO receipt, if you've set up the inspection frequencies properly, it's just going to create that QCS receiver for you. And then you can walk through that full flow that I showed today.
Thank you. And we have one more question. From Diana, and where can we find the process flow maps?
Yeah, that should be, Syteline has its own hub where you can look at the process flows. There are workbooks for this actually in Infor U. And then I think in the IA, the intelligence area, there's also a place where you can look at the QCS process flows. There may also actually be on the home form as well. You can see the process flows from there. But the main place I would start with would actually just be the workbooks because they're all within there as well.
Okay. I don't see any other question, but if you have any other question, please don't hesitate to ask. We still have time.
It's quite a few already. Got rapid fire questions.
Yeah. One more question. How can we do CO inspections on multiple items per order?
Yeah. So typically the receiver is linked to a specific item. So when you say multiple items, do you mean like different items or a quantity of items? Because if it's one item with a quantity of 10, it would be one receiver. If it's two separate items, you would create two separate receivers in that case. And from there, you would do inspections unique to each one and then disposition. Okay, multiple. Outside operation receipts I can see, I see one for outside operation receipts and in process with inspection on OP operation or separate operation. Yeah, so with an outside process, are you guys the one performing the outside process inspection or is the outside process vendor doing that? Because typically you could define the in process. If the vendor's doing it, then they might have it on their end. But typically, if you have your outside process, if you're doing an inspection after once it gets received back, you would just define that in the QCS items form and you just link the receiver to a specific routing step. So whether that's before the outside process or after the outside process. Sorry, I see there's so many questions coming in now.
Is there any other question?
Sorry, just to finish with was it Luis's question. Personally, I would do it as a separate operation. I like to have a formal routing step called QC. And the reason I like to say that is that it's just an easier visual trigger for end users that they see that the routing step is moved on to QC. They can't really ignore it. They have to go ahead and do the tests, right? If it's linked to the outside process, it requires a little bit more finesse in your internal process to make sure that the end user involved is aware that a QCS step needs to be performed.
Okay, Mitchell, we have two questions in the Q&A section too. From Lewis, would users will be able to see a flag or warning while accessing a part in the system that is subject to change request that is in progress?
A change request that is in process. Almost sounds like almost a side on like ECNs as well with the change, but typically the trigger that the user typically gets is at the point of PO receipt or at the point that the job is created. There is the ability within Syteline as well to use compliances. It's actually not tied to QCS. It's more so on the inventory side, but you can set compliances where all the items within a BOM need to be compliant before the job can even get released. That's another trigger that you can use to prevent any potential errors with processing something on the floor that has not fully been approved.
And we have one more question from Mark. Is there any way to put requisition for inspection report for every new batch order arrival based on PPPAP? An example would be is that providing material cert X-ray reports for every batch of casting delivery.
So every new batch, yes. So on the QC items form, you can define how often you want to inspect a product. So in most cases, you could do it for every single receipt. So every single PO for this item and this vendor, it is always going to create a QCS receiver for you. So you can never get away from it. So essentially you just flag certain items as, like for example, like a first article or a new vendor, I would personally create a QCS receiver for every single PO receipt. And then maybe if I'm accepting it every single time, I can tweak it back a bit and do every third PO receipt or so on and so forth.
Okay. Is there any other question? We had a lot of questions today, which is great. Okay. By the way, I've written down our email addresses to the chat section. If you have any questions to our speaker, Mitchell, you can send him an email, or for ESS general inquiry, you can write to info@essoft.com. Okay. Seems like we don't have any other question. We can close the webinar. And we appreciate you signing in today and hope you learned valuable insights. And thank you so much, Mitchell. It was perfect. Feel free to reach out to us if you're interested or want to know more about QCS modules of Infor CSI Syteline. And we will see you next time, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you so much.